This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
100
Welcome to 100 Songs That Define Heavy Metal. I'm your host, Brian Slagel. I am the CEO of Metal Blade Records. We have a new sponsor here at 100 Songs That Define Heavy Metal. It's the Metal Blade Museum and Store, located in Las Vegas, Nevada, right near the Strip. We have a ton of stuff in there from 43 years of Metal Blade. We've got Metallica stuff, we've got Slayer stuff, we've got Guar, we've got Lizzie Borden. We've got tons and tons of stuff in there. We've got vinyl that you can look at for old stuff. We've got a ton of artifacts. We also have a lot of metal bands, too, that Metal Blade has worked with, like Deep Purple and Alice Cooper and Stars and Guns N' Roses and Thin Lizzy. So there's a lot of great artifacts there. It really is the ultimate heavy metal museum. And recently, we also have moved our Metal Blade retail store into the museum. So that's in the first part. When you first walk in, the store is there. Free to get into the store. You got to pay to get into the museum. But for more information, go to metalblade.com/museum. Also, quick plug, I was involved in a show that's coming out on Hulu on September 22nd, which I believe is today, called Into the Void. Really cool stuff, a bunch of documentaries on some great bands like Pantera, Randy Rhoads, Judas Priest, a lot of really cool stuff. So check it out on Hulu if you're in the US, Crave in Canada, and if you're listening anywhere else in the world, hopefully it'll be available soon. Today, we are going deep into the regions of death metal. And one of the first death metal bands really to start the scene, Deicide, and the song Dead by Dawn. We're going to bring in my old friend, Monte Conner. Monte was a legendary A&R guy at Roadrunner Records. He's now at Nuclear Blast, and he's signed a million different bands, which I'll give you the list before Monte comes on. But a lot of great stuff that I'm sure all of you have seen. And Monte specifically wanted to talk about this song, Deicide, Dead by Dawn, which is from the first Deicide record, and really in the world of death metal is a very, very important song. So we do like to touch on the heavier stuff here. We don't want to leave any aspect of heavy metal not to be talked about, so we're going to talk about that today. We're going to bring in our old friend, Mr. Mark Lewis, as well, because he's super excited about this song. And we begin it all with our friend from the north, Mr. Martin Popoff.
Sweet choice, Brian. Deicide, Dead by Dawn, based on the Evil Dead. So yeah, this is obviously a super important death metal song and album, and another song from this album is a big deal, Sacrificial Suicide. Deicide's self-titled debut came out June 26, 1990, an absolutely archetypical Morris sound, Scott Burns production done in the B room. I mean, they weren't particularly happy with the production on it, but I mean, this is kind of what you want from this. This is really, really extreme, angry, satanic death metal at the time. You've got blast beats that are so blasting, it's almost into black metal. You've got these crazy, crazy, scary vocals on it at the 110 mark, where you've got the sort of ferocious kind of roaring going on behind him there. It's got a little bit of groove in it, a little bit of a groovy part. It's a long enough song at about 4 minutes. This song has 4.2 million plays on Spotify, and Sacrificial Suicide 5.8 million. So yeah, this is considered one of the top selling, American absolutely pure death metal albums of all time, along with The Morbid Angel. Glenn Benton, obviously vocals and bass. There was all that controversy about Glenn, saying got to commit suicide by 33 years old, and that all passed and went on, and he sort of said, yeah, it was just sort of asinine, stupid comments that he was making. But yeah, the guitar solos on here as well, man. Eric Hoffman, Brian Hoffman on guitars. great drum track from Steve Ashheim as well. Obviously, this band went through a lot of lineup changes as time goes on, but I find the vocals at time almost getting into a black metal caw. The velocities are at a black metal level. It's all very uptight and frantic to black metal levels. And this is before we really get formulated proper, Norwegian black metal. I mean, that's more of a 94 even, 94, 95, 96 kind of thing where it really starts solidifying. So it's almost to the point where this is more black metal than death metal. But it's an absolutely huge, important album. Like I say, Morbid Angel's considered big deal. Obviously, Cannibal Corpse is a huge deal as well. But this was absolutely extreme satanic black metal and just crazy, scary, creepy, jazzy, atonal, all that, which comes from Slayer, right? The guitar solo thing. But this just takes it like 3 steps further sort of thing. The whole bees buzzing, completely atonal, free jazz guitar soloing going on top of this. This album sold 96,000 copies. I mean, it was did really well for something this extreme. So yeah, great choice.
Thanks, Martin. Always good stuff from you. Appreciate you. He's on every episode, which is pretty.
This episode is brought to you by Credit Karma. When it comes to your money, Credit Karma keeps you ahead of the game. You can count on Credit Karma to keep up with your financial needs as they evolve, helping you monitor your progress and giving you personalized recommendations so you can make strides towards your goals. Make sure you're on the right track, no matter where you are on your financial journey. Intuit Credit Karma. Karma you can count on. Download today.
Cool. Well, we welcome back yet again our old friend Mark Lewis, who's produced and engineered and mixed about 4 million bands, which if I gave you the whole list would take up the entire segment. But he is currently working on Exodus and a metal band called Entheos. So thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us for a few minutes here.
It's a nice break. I appreciate you having me.
And again, it just seems like it was yesterday, and it almost was yesterday. We were talking about Scott Burns and Morrisound Studio, and here we are again talking about Scott Burns and Morrisound Studio at Deicide till dawn. So I made this point actually in talking to Monte Conner. I think Scott Burns and Morrisound in general doesn't get enough credit for really being an impetus to having death metal become so big early on, because they made it sound so good. And if it wasn't for them, if these bands were recording in some terrible studio somewhere, it probably wouldn't have sounded as good, and it might not have kind of become as big as it did so quickly.
It's funny because I know this record so well, and I've done a record with Deicide too, so I know how Glenn and Steve in particular work, and I think they're brilliant. And some people don't like the production of this record, but I think it's incredibly charming, and I think it really suits it. I know Glenn isn't happy with it. But man, I mean, you look at this, it's 35 years ago, which means they were writing these songs in the late 80s. And besides the sound, I think, being appropriate and just good, I can hear everything. It's not a fatiguing listen, in terms of the guitar sound. It's very mid-focus. It's not a particularly crunchy sound, but it gets a kind of a creepier vibe that way. It's a Divine Intervention feel, which post-dated this record. Or even you think Lamb of God, Palaces Burn, or a record like this. They have these like very mid-focus things that make them kind of feel like you're trapped in a coffin or something when you listen to them. You know what I mean? Like it's muted, but it's still energetic and exciting. I also admire Scott for letting most of these bands, or almost all these bands, use their own guitar rigs, which made his records sound drastically different from each other. You got to really take your hats off to them because it was just so far ahead of what everybody was doing. And it's not that it was brain surgery, it was that it was simplicity, and they weren't drowning everything in reverb, and they weren't using ridiculous drum samples, and it wasn't anything like that. It was just like, this is the band, and this is the band, hi-fi and clear, and the chips kind of fell where they were for every band, and a lot of it had to do with how prepared the band showed up, or whatever equipment they had that week or month.
Yeah, and I've mentioned this before, and I was a little bit late to the death metal party back in the day. It was, guys like Monty and Earache and, Relapse, those labels were, kind of signing all the death metal bands. I wasn't on board quite yet. wasn't because I didn't like the music as much, but I just didn't quite get it yet. And Deicide was definitely a band that I didn't really spend a lot of time with. Mass respect to them. I mean, they've been out on a bunch of tours with our bands, and they've always been really good and really cool to everybody. But I was never really got into them. And then when I asked Monte to do the show, which I think is because you and I were talking about Monte at some point, and I said, hey, I'd love you to do the show. And he's like, yeah, I'd love to do it. It'd be great. Like, who do you want to talk about? Thinking, he's signed a million different artists, but he was adamant I want to talk Deicide, and that's what I want to talk about. I'm like, oh, okay. So cool. But anyway, my point was I went back and started listening to this record in particular. It's like, well, I forgot. Like, this record's really good, and I love the production because it's really raw. And you tell it's band early in their career, so it's super raw.
Yeah. It's really just comes down to Scott letting every band be themselves and use their rigs, and that's a big deal. That's a big deal, man. It's not, he wasn't like, oh, you got to plug into my amps and my guitars and whatever. And of course, I know that Morrison had instruments there for people, but it wasn't like a lot of these studios now where you show up and a guy wants you to use his amps and his plugins and this and that and blah blah blah. It's like, oh, you hit the ground running with what you had that week or that month, and it's huge because the bands really had their own sounds, and Scott just made it hi-fi and clear and great, and there's no fad to those sounds. It's not drowned in stupid reverb or ridiculous drum samples or any of that stuff. It's just the right sounds for the bands, and that's huge because it made it digestible. It wasn't a distraction. It was just an enhancement. It's brilliant. They got out of their own way, and that's something a lot of producers nowadays still can't do.
So you mentioned earlier this was an important record for you, and you were super excited to talk about it. So what makes this record so important to you personally?
I just think it's brilliant. As an early guy, Deicide was, it was like Deicide and Suffocation were the ones that really gripped me. Cannibal Corpse really did too, and Morbid Angel as well, but something about Deicide, like just Glenn's vocals were just, especially in the early days, he was very clear. The riffs were just, I don't know, it was just the right thing for me. And I got to be honest, I think that Deicide, had they continued on the path they were with Once Upon the Cross, they could have easily been a Slayer status type band. And I don't know what happened with the business or why they made the decisions they did or who made the decisions or whatever it was, but I know that some records were made to get off contracts and things like that. And I don't, it's like they've always had these really great songs, and I wish that those later records, not to get too off track here, could have been turned into one great record. It's just, I always felt like they had it. They had the sound, they had the aesthetic. Glenn is a rock star. He is. I mean, he's just got the star quality, and especially back then he did. And man, those first three records were amazing. And the fourth, Serpents too. Yeah, it just had the things. And this record, it just gripped me, especially Dead by Dawn. Brilliant song structures, great lyrics, just everything about it is believable. I believe them.
Yeah, that's the one thing that I notice, and I've said this many times. People are like, well, why do you like death metal? Well, I like it because there's melody in it. People are, what? They all sound the same. I go, no, they don't all sound the same.
Not at all. Yeah.
That's why some bands are bigger than other bands, is because there's structure and there's songwriting. Monty talks about the songwriting, and I noticed that too. Again, not having not listened to this record for a long time, I went back and I go, you know what? The thing that really impressed me, especially with this song, is just it's a great song. It's like well written. There's great choruses. The lyrics are cool. The structure of the music is good. It's almost like you can look at it like just a really well crafted song, no matter what genre it's in. It's just a well crafted song.
It's amazing. And I'm not quite sure if Steve wrote most of this, because Steve the drummer writes a lot of their stuff. He's like a Charlie Benante type, or outside of this, like a Phil Collins type. He's the kind of the brainchild musically of the band, and I know that he wrote a lot of the early stuff, but the way the song comes back around, the song could have ended after the big solo section, but they brought it back, and then there's the Dead by Dawn hook, which is like the peak of the song, and then there's like another verse after that, or whatever it is. There's a lot of hooks in the song, and I think it's the longest song on the record, but it's just perfectly executed, and they were just on fire in terms of their arrangements. They've never been a fatty band. They never had shittily arranged songs, but this was definitely them at their peak, and everything was new. And I just think it's brilliant, and I love what Scott did with it. I mean, great stuff.
It's impressive too, because it's the first record, their debut album.
It's crazy to think it was 1990. I mean, you put that song on, and Steve is blasting. I mean, it's not the 250 BPM stuff that guys are doing nowadays, but I mean, that was 1990. I cannot imagine how that sounded to people 35 years ago, because there was nothing like that.
Yeah, that's why, they were so important to the scene, and maybe that's another reason why they never got as big as they should have, because, the early adapters of anything are always the ones that kind of get, the bands that come a little bit later go a little further, but they're still, like, in the annals of death metal, they're still one of the top selling death metal bands of all time. And just to your thing, it's credited as written by Deicide, all four of the guys. But I don't know how, if they just did that to, be cool and put everybody in there. I'm sure everybody had their stake in it.
Yeah.
But I did hear that Steve was kind of the main guy in terms of the music.
Yeah, and to be fair, like, when I made the record with him, Glenn came in later in the process, and I had made some arrangement suggestions to Steve, and it's not that he wasn't open to it, but he's like, let's see how it goes and whatever. And then Glenn came in, and his arrangement ideas, they were brilliant. And he heard it, from a singer's standpoint, and came in a day, and we were able to really chop up a whole record of fairly long songs. And then he really trimmed all the fat and was like, this is my chorus, I need this here, this is what I want here, blah blah blah. He's a brilliant arranger. He's a big picture guy, like a Lars or somebody like that. And I'll give all that credit to Glenn, at least from my experience, because I think it's easy to take a character like Glenn and say, oh, maybe he's not even a musician, he's just an actor, And the same thing people might think about Gene Simmons, but like Gene is clearly a good musician if you take the time to look at who he is and what he's been a part of. But it's also easy to say, is this guy even a player? What does he do? Is he just a bigger than life thing? And it was surprising to me. It wasn't that I ever doubted him. It was like, wow, this guy is clearly a big part of the sound of this band. And it's just cool to see how they operate. Yeah,
anytime somebody has a bigger than life character, or a show like Alice Cooper or Kiss, they always kind of go, that's the music kind of gets put in the background a little bit. Not that Deicide had a big show, but obviously Glenn is an interesting personality. He's done a lot of crazy things, and that sometimes overshadows the music a little bit. But
100%, yeah.
Like I said, going back again and listening to it, I have a much more affinity to what they did, and I just love going back and listening to those Morris sound, especially Scott Burns records. I got to work with him on 6 Feet Under for a couple records, and it was, I've known him obviously forever, but to work with him and be in the studio with him was a lot of fun, because and this is the best producers. They're just super laid back and chill and patient, and all the things you have to be when you're a producer. So
no, I got to meet him once with you and Scott, and he was brilliant. He was great, and it was just, he was so gracious and cool, and it was really cool experience. And I feel the same. There was just so much. They're just they were a real studio. The times that I worked in there, it was a big commercial studio. During the day they might be doing jingles or car commercials or whatever the hell, and then at night they're in the other room doing Deicide or whatever. And it was so well run. It was just one of those real studios like you'd find in Manhattan or LA, and it was just a really special place. And it was a big thing for me, to experience that and see like what that studio was like, and also annoy the shit out of Jim and Tom, which I've talked about on here before. Yeah. It's a cool place, and it felt special, maybe because I knew what was there. But there's a reason that they sound so good. Yeah, and the first time I went there was kind of, I wouldn't say, I was surprised at how nice the studio was, because I knew it was pretty nice just from talking to bands that have been in there. But first time I actually went in there, I was like, wow, this is like a real studio, like really nice studio. Yeah. And they were so great to all the bands and the labels and everything back then, because they could have easily charged us 2 or 3 or 4 times as much as they did, but Jim and the Morrises were so nice to everybody, and again they had such a Morris sound, and those guys all had such a big hand in the scene growing, because they made these bands sound really good. It's super cool, and just the real deal. I'm nearly positive they made that record in the B Room, which was like the smaller studio there, which is still far nicer than most studios operating today, which is really cool. Yeah, they're just brilliant. I mean, Tom designed those rooms, and I think he was a chemical engineer, which is how that Morris sound came to be. I think he patented something and made some money or something, which is how it came to be. So Tom and Jim too, but they were like next level guys. They weren't just savant musicians who got some ADATs. It was like they did it right, and it was a real place. And it's crazy, now we have death metal still going, and it's a blue collar, and for some guys a white collar living to do this stuff, and they were the ones that made it a palatable thing and didn't neuter it.
100%. Well, thanks as always, my friend. Always good to see you, and appreciate you doing this. And thanks again. I'm sure we'll see you very soon once more.
Thanks for having me.
This episode is brought to you by Stouffer's. Here comes 3-time juggling champion Natalia Rogers. She's juggling law school, her TA job. Oh, narrowly catches the laundry. What's that fourth ball? Parents unexpectedly showed up at dinner time? Is that too much for Natalia? Not with Stouffer's Chicken Alfredo and its mouth-watering mix of Asiago, Romano, and Parmesan. When you're juggling 4 things at once and the clock strikes dinner, think Stouffer's.
All right. So we're going to welcome in someone who is more behind the scenes. If you don't know who he is, look at his Wikipedia. It's very impressive. He is an absolute legend in the A&R world. I believe his Metal Injection said the best metal and rock A&R person of all time, or something crazy like that. Spent many, many years at Roadrunner Records, signing a bunch of incredible bands, including one we're going to talk about in a few minutes. And now he's at Nuclear Blast Records doing the same thing. Mr. Monte Conner, how are you, sir?
How you doing, Brian? Very honored to be here.
Honored to have you.
Thank you for all the nice things you said about me. But if anybody asks me who my A&R hero is and who the person I look up to is, it's you. You've been doing it since 1982, a good 5-6 years before me. So you're the guy I look up to. So thank you for the nice words, but I have to give it back.
Yeah, thank you. That's just because I'm old, but that's okay. I'll take it. I'll take it. So we're going to talk about the band Deicide today. So I have to admit that I was not in early on the death metal thing. It took me a little while to get to it. Not that I didn't like it or think it was cool. It took me a minute to warm up to it. You, on the other hand, were one of the early adopters of this genre. So where did you first hear it, and what drew you to it?
Well, I mean, I first discovered death metal, when it was invented, right? Who invented death metal? I think these days, a lot of people will credit the band Possessed because they actually coined the word, right? They had the song death metal. So technically, they were probably the first to use it. I can't recall if Possessed predates death, though. I don't remember when Seven Churches came out or the Possessed demo, but I know that a lot of people would say Chuck Schuldiner and Death are the ones that invented the genre.
I've gone back and talked to a lot of people. I think you make a very valid point with Possessed, and they were on a Metal Massacre early on, like probably 86 or so. So they probably were early, and you can go back, when you talk about who invented heavy metal, it's obviously Black Sabbath, but you go back to Blue Cheer and, some of that stuff too. And I think it's kind of similar with death metal, but I think just Death and Chuck Schuldiner that you mentioned was the guy that, that when that first Death record came out, that was, okay, there's a genre here.
Yeah, but I mean, to me, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I heard the early Mantis demos. Mantis is the band that became Death. If I'm remembering correctly, I heard those even before I heard the Possessed demo. So for me, just looking back, it's definitely those two bands, but probably Death for me. And yeah, so I was right there, as part of the scene in the 80s, being a tape trader, being really into the whole underground emerging scene. And that's the first time I heard the music, and I just fell in love with it because you know what it's like back in the 80s, Brian, like when this new form of music emerged, right? Once you hear Venom, okay, what comes after Venom? What's heavier than Venom, right? And then you just keep craving the next heaviest thing. And when death metal came along, those were the heaviest vocals you could get. Like, you couldn't really say that Venom has death metal vocals, right? I mean, Kronos is kind of death metal vocals, but not really, not like the kind of vocals Jeff Becerra is doing or what Chuck Schuldiner was doing. So naturally, when death metal came along and I heard those type of vocals, okay, that was my new favorite kind of music. That was like as heavy as it could get. That was like the new frontier of what we were into. So I was into it from the beginning. I didn't start at Roadrunner until early 1988. So I wasn't in a position to sign some of these bands. I was just like an observer, right? And then, of course, I got lucky enough to be in a position to start signing death metal myself. And at the time, the only label I was competing against really was Earache. It was Roadrunner and Earache trying to sign all the cool bands. Although you came in fairly early with Cannibal Corpse, right? Eaten Back to Life was what, 89, I think?
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
89, but it was still a couple of years after. I mean, you guys and Relapse was in there as well. I think signing a whole, like, really the cream of the crop of all that early death metal stuff.
But hey, you got a good one. I mean, Cannibal Corpse, arguably, are the most successful death metal band ever, and for several reasons. Because they're the longest running. They're the band that has consistently been putting out records the whole time. So they have the most records, therefore the most sales, the most streams. Like, they are like the godfathers of death metal. Yeah. You may not be a death metal expert, but you got the king band.
I grew to really love it. I love it now, obviously, if you've listened to the label, but probably more than any other genre is probably where we at. And then there's all the subgenres of death metal. Like, for example, I just saw Amon Amarth last night open for Pantera. And Amon Amarth is, their melodic death metal is what they call it. But they've kind of morphed into just a regular metal band, I think. And they're, strangely enough, they become kind of an arena band. Like, every time I see them, they're playing arenas. It's insane. But the Cannibal thing was really funny too, just to give you a bit of an example of where I was at with the death metal scene at that point. So your friend and my friend who's been at Metal Blade forever, Mike Faley, who's from Buffalo, New York, brought in this demo tape from this band from Buffalo, New York, named Cannibal Corpse. And before I even put it in, I looked at the song titles, and there's song on there called "A Skull Full of Maggots." And I said, I don't really care if this sounds any good. I want to sign it just because I want to put out a song called Skull Full of Maggots.
And that's such a tame title compared to the shit that came after.
Well, yeah. At the time, that was cool.
Brian, you know what's ironic? You're mentioning Buffalo, because I had a person in my office that also came from Buffalo who's a DJ at a radio station, Mark Psycho Abramson, right? We called him Psycho back then, but now he wants his respect. Got to call him Mark Abramson. And, Mark was doing radio for us, and he knew about Cannibal Corpse. And really, this was at the height of me, like, grabbing any death metal I could get. He was trying to get me to sign Cannibal Corpse. And I just wasn't into it. Like, I just didn't think it was as good as some of the other stuff I was signing. But then, of course, I lived to regret that decision. And it wasn't so much Eaten Back to Life. It was, what was the second record?
Butchered at Birth.
Right. When I heard Butchered at Birth, right, that's when I was like, shit, I should have signed these guys, So, yeah, Cannibal was on my radar, but you can't have them all, right?
Exactly. Because it's interesting when because once I started getting more into death metal, I just talking to people about, so what, like, where did this come from? And really what it boiled down to, the early death metalers were like, hey, look, music's getting heavier and heavier and heavier, but the vocals can only go so far when you're singing. So what's the natural progression? Let's do something heavier, and let's make it sound as heavy as the music. And that's when it really clicked in my head, like, that makes a lot of sense, because now the vocals are just as heavy as the music, and it became, so extreme.
But then it changed also, because if you're listening to a band like Death didn't have blast beats.
Correct.
Right? Like, okay, so you had Death, that when you had the death metal genre formed, okay, how do we make death metal heavier? Well, let's bring in blast beats. And then you had Morbid Angel bringing in blast beats, Napalm Death, right? Like, that was like the next frontier for death metal, Suffocation, and that made it even heavier.
So we're talking about Deicide today, and the great song Death by Dawn. Why, so what did you pick the Deicide to begin with, and why this song?
Well, interestingly enough, the way I found Deicide was that they had gone in and made a demo with Scott Burns. I'm sure you were in touch with Scott Burns a lot back then as well. But anytime a band would come through Morrisound that was unsigned and would make a demo, if Scott felt it was worthy, he would start sending it out to his friends at labels. And I was doing a lot of business with Scott Burns back then. We did Obituary, Slowly We Rot, we did Beneath the Remains. I was pretty much the first guy to hire Scott Burns to start producing and mixing. So we had a really, really close relationship, and he had Deicide in. They were called Amon at the time, and they had come in to record a 6-song demo. We call it a demo, but when you're recording at Morrisound, it's not a demo, it's a professional recording. The bands call it a demo because it's what they're going to take to shop, right? But it's not really a demo, it's a master tape. Scott had told them that they should send it to me. Glenn is originally from Buffalo, like Cannibal Corpse, and I guess Malevolent Creation has roots in Buffalo. So Glenn was up in Buffalo visiting his parents, right? So driving back to Florida, he stopped by in my office, just unannounced, came barging in, threw the demo down on my desk, and we had a brief conversation. And he told me that they had done it with Scott, which right away piqued my interest. And the minute he left the office, I played the demo, right? Became a record. We put that demo out later as a record called Amon Feasting the Beast. So you could hear that 6-song demo that I signed them from. It's on that release. And the minute I heard it, it just blew me away. Because where I think that Deicide edged all other death metal bands was in Glenn's vocals. I mean, Glenn is just, still to this day, my favorite death metal vocalist. And when I say that, I mean the Glenn from back in that era. Obviously, he's older now. Your voice has changed. You're in a different place. But I'm talking about the Glenn when he first started out. The enunciation in his voice, the power that he had, it just blew me away. And also, he doesn't get enough credit for this, but Glenn is the guy that pioneered the use of like double tracking vocals. Like you're having these heavy guttural vocals, then you're having like a high pitched demon scream behind it, right? Nobody was doing that before Glenn. And if you listen to the first Deicide record, you have that layering all over the record. And specifically in the song Dead by Dawn, which is one of the reasons why I suggest that this be the song we talk about, because that's the song on the record that most employs that technique. I mean, you hear it all over the place. And when I heard it, I'm like, I'd never heard anything like it. I just thought it was made it just sound fucking insane. Yeah, I just fell in love with it. The minute Glenn left my office and I popped that tape in, I was just like, I have to sign this band. And that was before I even knew about what a character Glenn was, that he would burn an upside down cross in his head, you know, like the whole shtick that goes along with Glenn Benton. I fell in love with Deicide for their music and getting Glenn Benton and all his antics. And, you know, that was just like icing on the cake, you know, afterwards.
It's interesting because, you know, I talked to so many different people, especially, you know, guys our age that never got into death metal, don't understand it. And I try to explain to them, and it's kind of the same with any sort of genre that you don't understand, any type of music you don't understand, I guess. But to me, it all comes down to melody. And like, what people ask me, well, what's the difference between all these different death metal bands? Well, it's just melody like anything else. There's melody in all these songs, just like there's melody in Slayer or Metallica or whatever it is. And vocally and musically, there's a melody, and the good bands have better melodies and in what they're doing, and the other bands not so much. And especially the vocals, because that's the one thing that where everybody kind of stops and goes like, I can't get into the vocals. It's like, well, if you really listen to them, there's a lot of melody in that. It's heavy and it's extreme. But the good vocalists, like you mentioned, Glenn, and he, you know, back in the day, you're 100% right, was spectacular. Like he's doing, like you could take those vocals out and sing them and they would sound amazing. I think that's why I try to tell people you would get it that way.
Well, but also, you know, first of all, there is melody in Deicide's music, right? If you listen to like some of the guitar parts, there is some melody to be found.
Of course.
But also with Deicide, what attracted me to them was just, you know, they have hooks, right? Their music, and you can't really say the same about Cannibal. Yep. That was one of my issues with Cannibal early on, is I couldn't listen to like Eaten Back to Life at the time and pick out hooks and choruses and parts I would remember to the same level as you would in a band like Deicide. I just love the fact that the songs were structured, that there were hooks. And of course, death metal has evolved now to a different place, right? Where I think with a lot of the new school kids these days, they don't care about having repetition and structure. They don't care if a song goes from point A to point F and just like has all these different stops. Like they don't need things to come back and repeat. To me, death metal these days, it's more like an Olympic event, right? Like, okay, how many animals can the singer sound like? How fast? It's just like, it's the Olympics. Like everybody's just trying to do everything to an extreme, right? And they don't care about structure. They don't care about choruses. Back in the day when I was signing these bands, that's what attracted me to them. Was the fact that the records were structured on. And skipping ahead, you look at a record like Once Upon the Cross, right? I mean, that is probably the best Deicide record. And I always make a joke about that record that it sounds like a death metal record, but if you strip it down to its essence, which is like these 3.5 minute songs with not an ounce of fat, with verses, pre-chorus, chorus, and repeating structures, you really could play any of those songs on that record on an acoustic guitar. I mean, they could be Bon Jovi songs. Like, it's really like such a hyper commercial death metal record. People don't even realize how commercial Once Upon the Cross is because it kicks their head in. But it's a commercial record. I
think that's the case with all really good death metal, is that it's basically the you know, take the vocals out. It's heavy metal music, and if you take the vocals out, it's metal. I took, and again, you know, I mentioned Amon Amarth earlier, and they're an interesting example because they came from the death metal world, but they're not really there now. But our friend Eddie Trunk, who's doesn't get into any of the heavy stuff, doesn't like it, just out of the blue said, Monomar's playing Vegas, I want to go. I'm like, oh, well, come with me. So we went to the show, and Amon Amarth's music is it sounds like Iron Maiden, basically. It's very commercial sounding stuff. And Eddie was watching the show. He goes, oh, this is actually really good. The vocals don't bother me that much. And, the music's just like regular metal. So we talked to the band afterwards, even played it on their show. But that's what I always try to tell people, is that these songs by all these great bands, and you're 100% right, these are catchy, almost structured, you could say, even in a pop way, about how the songs are structured and the way they are. That's why I love talking to people who really love death metal, trying to explain it to people. And I think once you kind of get into it like that, you can understand it a lot better.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting what you said about Amon Amarth too, because to me, the best part is when you have a band, you sign them as a death metal band, but they evolve into like a metal band, right? And I was lucky enough to have that happen twice, both with Sepultura and Fear Factory. They started out as death metal bands, and then they evolved into just, people aren't going to call Fear Factory a death metal band now. They're not going to call Sepultura a death metal band the same way they wouldn't say that about Amon Amarth.
No.
So to me, like, I wasn't just signing these bands purely to be death metal bands. Like, in some cases I was, right? Like, Deicide's always going to be Deicide. Like, it's not going to morph into a bigger picture anything. It's going to stay within that genre. To me, the brass ring was to sign a band that could be a credible death metal band that might one day evolve into something bigger. Exactly like Sepultura Fear Factory.
Exactly. And, we talked about just recently with the great Jose Mangin about Sepultura. And that was, really a groundbreaking band, because they were the first band to kind of come from the death metal scene and break out and become this massive brand and band. It was morphed into two bands now, I guess. But yeah, it's just it's incredible how they did that. When we go back to the 70s and, even like, Sabbath and Purple and some of those bands, or even, Judas Priest, that stuff was so extreme back then. And it's like those bands are never to be big. I remember Priest was like, that is some, underground heavy metal band. And then they became huge, and everything goes over time where that stuff happens again. And now you see, Sepultura kind of broke the doors open, and then, so many other bands are hugely popular in a large part because of them too.
Yeah, I agree.
And I agree with you too about Deicide, and that's why it was really interesting that you picked them, because we haven't talked a lot of death metal on the show, but it's an extremely important part, and we're getting to more of it now, which I like. But Deicide, I think because of Glenn's personality and his histrionics, or whatever you want to call it, they don't really get enough credit, almost like the way Alice Cooper did, I think, because of his stuff. I don't think they get enough credit as to how good a band they were and how influential they were on the death metal scene.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to me, I really think that Deicide were the pinnacle band as far as that scene goes, because I just feel that Glenn Benton, it was superior to all those other vocalists. He sounded scarier. You could understand his words. He was very enunciated. He pioneered the demon scream, or whatever you want to call it, layering the high-pitched wails behind the death metal guttural vocals, and just being a great songwriter. And, not to take away anything from the other members of, Steve Ashheim on drums, the Hoffman brothers at the beginning, and the guitarist that Glenn has worked with since. Just really a pioneering death metal band. I don't think that there was any band really that could touch what Deicide were doing on their first 4 records. I'm including, the first Deicide record, self-titled, Legion, Once Upon the Cross, and Serpents of the Light. Serpents of the Light doesn't really get the respect that Once Upon the Cross does, but Serpents of the Light really is Once Upon the Cross Part 2. It just didn't have the heavy production. It had a crappier production than Once Upon the Cross, so people don't really give it those same props, but that record is almost equally as amazing as Once Upon the Cross. So I don't think there was really any death metal band that could touch Deicide back then. I mean, maybe Morbid Angel were like challenging, ton of respect for Morbid Angel.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, absolutely.
By the way, if you didn't know Monte was in New York City, you can certainly tell by the siren there in the background.
Are they loud?
No, it was fine. I love it. I mean, it makes me miss New York a bit more. But the one thing that we do have to talk about when we're talking about the death metal scene, the early death metal scene, you mentioned him already a few times, is Scott Burns, and also Morris Sound Studios. And we've talked about them before on the show, with Sepultura and some other stuff. Just like a lot of the early, pick any early, Bill Matoya, for example, if there wasn't like a producer around that understood the music and make it sound good, and Scott Burns being the guy for the death metal scene in the early days. I mean, I think that was so important to get a really good producer engineer in there and play in a really good studio and make this stuff sound really good. Because if you didn't have that, it would have been much more difficult, I think.
Yeah, I mean, prior to Scott, there was nobody like in that side of the industry that really understood the music and could capture it and get it to sound good. And that's why we did so many records with Scott and so many records at Mars Sound. And I mean, you know Scott, he's like literally the nicest guy you could ever meet, the most humble.
Of course.
He won't even own any of his success. He's too humble to even do that.
Yep.
You know, Scott worked inexpensively, worked tirelessly, and was just always on the side of the bands wanting to do things right. Brian, you would know this, like back in the day, it became very common for producers to take points on records, right? So you hire so-and-so, you know, Colin Richardson, and you pay him 2 points, 3 points as a producer. That was kind of the norm back then. Scott refused to take points. He didn't want to take it from the bands, right? He's like, I'm coming in, you're hiring me for like a month to make a record. It's work for hire. It's like hiring a plumber, right? You bring a plumber into your house to fix your sink. He doesn't leave with like a point on your sink or anything other than like what, you know, you just hired him to be a plumber. That's how Scott looked at it. Just work for hire, right? There's no reason why you should take points. It's a cash grab against the bands. And that was just another brilliant thing about Scott that made him like a real advocate and friend of the bands, is that he really, really, truly cared.
Yeah, and those of you who don't know what a point is a percentage of the royalties that usually comes from the bands. When the producers take the points, it generally comes out of the band share. And it's not uncommon to do that. But you do mention, yeah, Scott was just all about the bands making it and the band sounding good. But, you know, for him to understand that type of music and really make it sound that good was, again, I think a huge piece in what helped make this scene, especially in the early days in Tampa. And also Morris Sound, which is, you know, now a historical landmark in Tampa, Florida, which is great because it's a wonderful, beautiful studio. And again, you know, it's a state-of-the-art studio. And here you have these, you know, underground death metal bands with a great producer recording in the state-of-the-art studio that, you know, lended these records to sound so good. Like I was listening to this song and record the other day, and I forgot, like, man, this sounds so good. I put it up against anything that you listen to today. And for example, a producer like Rick Rubin, you know, his style is very similar to what Scott was doing in the early 80s with the way he makes his records sound.
What Scott saw as the challenge of death metal was, how do we make everybody in the band heard, right? How do we take this music and you can hear what everybody's actually doing? And, you know, Scott and Morris Sound are, you know, the pioneers of the quote unquote typewriter kick drum. Right? Like the clicky type, they invented that. And I think the reason Scott came up with that is because by adding the typewriter sound allowed you to hear what the kick drums were doing. Right? I mean, that was Scott's ultimate goal, was to get every instrument heard.
Yeah, and it's really hard in this genre to do it because metal in general is difficult because you've got low bass, the guitars are always low, and like I said, you've got the kick drums, and everything's kind of in the same low mid range. And trying to get the separation on all those is always very difficult. Well, now you add in the vocals of death metal that are also very low and guttural. It's all in that same space. So you're 100% right. To get everything heard is very difficult. So the logical thing for Scott to do was, make the kick drums a little lighter so you could actually hear them.
And, you know, and then Pantera kind of kept that going too, right? Like, you know, Pantera also had the triggered kicks.
Yep.
I think bands are doing that less these days, obviously. It's not as challenging these days to get everything heard because technology has come so far that if you listen to, like, you know, an Amon Amarth record or some of these records we're working on now, and you put them up against these old records, it just, I mean, they kind of dwarf them, right?
Well, yeah, technology is so insane now, of course.
So I think it's a little less challenging to do that. But back then, yes, Scott, the only way you were going to get the kick drums heard is to make them sound like typewriters.
Yeah, it makes sense. It makes complete sense.
But, you know, it wasn't just Scott. I mean, you had Tom Morris and Jim Morris also.
Yes.
You know, was those, and Dan Johnson, of course. How do I forget Dan? Like, those were the four guys that collectively put Morris Sound on the map. Of course, Scott was the death metal portion of that. But some of these other death metal bands also worked with Dan, Tom, and Jim because, like, you know, you couldn't,
yes,
you know, you want to, like, share the wealth. Scott's busy doing different things and bands find other people they like. So they were really all doing that over time. But it was really Scott that began it, that brought death metal into Morris Sound.
Yeah, and the other thing that I always find interesting with the whole death metal genre, and, you know, we'll put Glenn Benton to the side for a minute on this one, but is just the fact that everybody's just normal, regular guys. You know, they're not doing anything crazy. I remember being in the studio with Cannibal Corpse. I forget which record, one of the early records. And Morbid Angel was in, Morristown had 2 studios there. And, Morbid was in one studio and Cannibal was in the other. We just kind of hang out in the break room. And I remember talking to Trey, who was in Morbid Angel at the time. And just a bunch of really good guys. And we're just talking about, life events and politics or whatever it is. And it's just like this normal conversation, normal kind of, everybody just hanging around like normal people. And people always think, oh, these death metal guys, they're so crazy and these lyrics are so insane and it's all dark and everything. It's like, no, they're like horror movies, it's just the people aren't like that at all.
Exactly. I mean, look, they're really all actors in a way, right? Like, remember when we first heard Venom?
Yes.
I remember when I first heard Welcome to Hell. I thought I was going to hell if I just played that thing. I was like, people are going to laugh their heads off now hearing this, but like, you could identify with this too. Back then, it was so scary. It was terrifying. And you really thought that the guys in Venom were these dudes. But then you meet them and they're just a bunch of fucking clowns. They're just jokers. It's all a shtick. And that includes Glenn Benton, right? I mean, Glenn was like more convincing than most, right? He actually went ahead and burned an upside down cross in his head. So if there's anybody that you thought would be that scary guy in person, it was Glenn. But it's quite the opposite. If you've seen interviews with Glenn, he's a joker. He's like hysterical. He'll have you cracking up the whole time. It really is that way in most cases. Now, I wouldn't say the same thing about some of these black metal bands from Norway, these like church burning dudes. Like some of those dudes are the real deal. Like that is no act,
Yeah, that's a bit different. That's a bit different, not in a good way.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. But yeah, what you're saying about like these death metal guys being normal guys, you could really say that way about any one of these bands, whether it's Carcass or fucking Deicide or Cannibal Corpse or Morbid Angel. They're normal dudes,
You're 100% right about all that stuff. But I do agree with you about Venom. I remember when that record came out. Even before that, I had heard their original singles that they put out on the Great Neat Records, which was a huge influence, I'm sure, to both of us. But yeah, that first Venom record was scary. You're 100% right. That was scary. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is insane.
To me, that record still beats black metal. I mean, I know black metal's the more famous record, but there's something about Welcome to Hell that just is even better.
Oh, I agree 100%. I mean, I love black metal, of course, the name black metal, but I think that first Venom record is just tremendous.
And of course, it only lasted for two albums for Venom because
I know.
Then you hear At War with Satan. It looks the part. You want it to be great, but there's something about At War with Satan. It just doesn't have what those first 2 records have. I describe it as, and Brian, you'd appreciate this, like a band is in the zone, right? When you're in the zone, you're just shitting out the fucking magic, right? You're not even trying hard. It's just pouring out of you. And that's what you heard on those first 2 Venom records. And then somehow At War with Satan comes along. And it's got a great cover. It's got a great title. It's exactly what you want it to be. But then you put it on, and there's just something missing. Like the band left the zone somehow, And once you're out of the zone, it's really, really hard to get back in.
I equate it to, you're pushing a boulder up the side of a mountain. As long as you're going forward, you're doing well. You start going backwards, it's really hard to get that ball rolling again. Same thing like you mentioned. So it's unfortunate. Yeah. But anyway, dude, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. Great insight on the early days of death metal. And yeah, it's always good to talk to you anyway. So thanks again for doing this.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. That's it for this one. Thank you big time for Monte Conner. Great to have him on. Super great guy. I've known him forever. Mark Lewis as well. Martin Popoff, who we hear every time, and he's always giving us lots of good information. Lizzie Borden with our theme song, and the man who makes everything go, Mr. Christian Blatt, our producer. So we'll see you guys next episode.
100